All right, so today we're going to talk briefly about the mechanisms of evolution, the criteria that need to be met in order for natural selection to take place. We'll talk briefly about the process of natural selection and make sure you're familiar with some examples to support the theory. So the first criteria that is assumed in order for natural selection to take place is the overproduction of offspring. This leads to a struggle for survival amongst siblings and competition. This is true of human beings as well. There were times in history where, people assumed that they would only expect a 50% survival rate amongst their children. While this is still true in some underdeveloped countries, with the advent of medical technology and medical care and family planning, which has been incorporated into many cultures, that's really reduced the infant mortality rate amongst humans. But for most organisms, it is still assumed to be so. The next criteria which has to be present is variation within a species. This will either increase or decrease individuals' chances of survival. So the first source of these variations will be random mutations. These random mutations can take place just when, by basic mistakes when the DNA gets copied. The second source of genetic variation, of course, is sexual reproduction in organisms which do in fact sexually reproduce. This allows each offspring to get 50% of the genetic material from each parent. Now remember, in the case where a heterozygote is produced, the individual may evidence the dominant trait and yet still have that recessive trait to pass on to their offspring. The third factor which increases these phenotypic and genotypic variations is meiosis. So there's two ways in which meiosis or meiosis, depending on how you want to say it, increases this genetic variation. The first is crossing over, which takes place in prophase 1. And you remember the tetrad forms. The arms of the chromosomes break at various locations, swap genetic material with a chromosome from the other parent, and produce recombinant chromosomes. So the second way that meiosis will increase this variety is in the law of random assortment, which takes place during metaphase 1. You may recall at this point, each gamete can receive a chromosome from that pair, which is identical to parent 1, a chromosome which is identical to parent 2, a recombinant chromosome from parent 1 and 2, or the complementary or inverse recombinant chromosome from parent 2 and 1. Now let's talk briefly about natural selection. Of course, the main idea here is, survival of the fittest. So the first tenet is that some organisms are better suited to survive in their environment due to their genotypic and phenotypic variations. When the environment affects an individual's chance of survival, that is considered to be a selective pressure. Remember that the environment can select for or against a particular phenotype. So some instances where the environment selects for a particular phenotype would be camouflage, another would be mimicry. If you aren't sure about the difference between those, you need to look it up. I'll give you a quick example. An example of camouflage would be a chameleon blending in with its environment, whereas an example of mimicry could be the monarch butterfly and the swallowtail. One of them tastes very bad, the other does not. Birds have learned that colorant or color pattern in the butterflies, tastes bad. So while one species does not taste bad, it mimics the coloring of the species which does, and thus increases its chance of survival. Sometimes mimicry and camouflage, it's difficult to differentiate between them. In the case of an insect which is mimicking a leaf, when that insect is on a particular plant species, it will then be camouflage. So sometimes both can take place simultaneously. Some examples where the environment selects against particular phenotypes would be albinoism. In most environments, that increases their chance of being predated. Although in the Arctic environment, it will actually increase their chances of survival. Sickle cell anemia is another example where it selects against the homozygous recessive phenotype, but selects for the heterozygote, increasing its resistance to malaria. IB really likes to use that one, so I would be aware of that. Of course, then the idea is that these survivors pass their genetic traits on to their offspring, and over time we will see the frequency of those genotypic alleles increase in the population. Of course, if the allele is selected against, it will decline. So some examples you definitely need to be familiar with are the pepper moth, of course, Bistum bitularia. That's what that little insect activity that was so simple was really mimicking. I'm going to have you do a little reading about that here in a few minutes. A second is MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. This selects against the weak bacteria and selects for the strong bacteria, which are resistant to the antibiotics. These have emerged in recent years. Many believe it's due to the overprescription of antibiotics, also the misuse of antibiotics, not completing the whole regimen, or not taking them at appropriate times throughout the day. Throughout the world, we are seeing a number of different antibiotic-resistant strains of diseases emerge. TB is another one. That is quite prevalent in underdeveloped countries. Here in the United States, we thought we had it wiped out, but now it has reemerged primarily in recent immigrant populations, which then, of course, it can spread from there, amongst the homeless population and populations which are struggling with HIV, more so with active AIDS. So the conclusion here is that species evolve through natural selection. Remember that individuals are incapable of evolving. An individual bird, like Darwin's finches, cannot wake up one morning and decide to suddenly grow a larger beak in order to adapt to its environment. Individuals do not adapt, populations do. Populations can then, of course, evolve to the point where they speciate and become distinct species. The idea is that greater survival and reproductive success of individuals with these favorable genetic traits will then lead to a change in the characteristics of the population. So I'm going to have you watch this video, and then when you're finished watching the video, you need to come back to this slide and go to this WordPress site and do the quick reading on the pepper moth. Please jot down any questions you may have or anything you need clarification on, and then go to the final slide. That is where you will find your homework. It is also where you will find information about how we're going to approach retest options for the ecology test. Thanks for listening.